Do you feel like you're still waiting? Waiting for the words that never come. Waiting for your adult children to turn around and say, "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry, Dad. I was wrong." And every holiday that passes, every birthday call that feels a little too brief, every text message that goes unanswered just a little too long, you tell yourself, maybe this time, maybe today they'll finally see it. Maybe they'll acknowledge the hurt. But they don't. And here's the part no one talks about, the part that sits heavy in your chest at 3 in the morning when you can't sleep. You start to wonder if the problem is you. If maybe you're being too sensitive, too needy, too stuck in the past. You replay the arguments in your mind, dissecting every word you said, every boundary you set, every moment you stood your ground. And you ask yourself, was I wrong to expect more? Let me tell you something that might change everything. What if I told you that waiting for that apology is quietly stealing years of peace from you? What if the very act of waiting is keeping you trapped in a cycle of hurt that doesn't have to define the rest of your life? And what if, just maybe, there's a way to find freedom, dignity, and even joy without ever hearing those 2 words? By the end of this conversation, you're going to understand why that apology may never come, not because you don't deserve it, but because of forces that have nothing to do with your worth. You'll discover the 5 shifts that happen when you stop waiting and start reclaiming your emotional freedom. And most importantly, you'll learn how to rebuild your sense of peace on your own terms, without depending on anyone else to give it to you. Because here's the truth. You deserve to live fully right now, not in some distant future where everything is finally resolved. Let me tell you about a woman named Claire. She's 73, a retired school teacher, and for nearly 8 years, she carried the weight of a fractured relationship with her daughter. It started over something that felt small at the time. A disagreement about how Claire had handled her grandchildren during a visit. Words were said, voices were raised, and then silence. Her daughter stopped calling as often. Visits became strained, and Claire, in her heart, kept waiting for her daughter to come back and say, "Mum, I overreacted, I'm sorry." But 8 years went by. 8 Christmases, 8 birthdays, and Claire found herself shrinking. She stopped hosting family dinners because she was afraid of more conflict. She stopped sharing her feelings because she didn't want to be seen as difficult. She became quieter, smaller, less herself. And one day, sitting in her living room surrounded by old photo albums, she realized something that shook her to her core. She had been putting her own life on hold, waiting for permission to feel okay again. That's when she made the decision. She stopped waiting, not because she stopped caring, not because the hurt disappeared, but because she finally understood that her peace could not be held hostage by someone else's timeline. This is where so many of us get stuck. We believe that the apology is the key, that once we hear it, everything will fall into place, the hurt will dissolve, the relationship will heal, we'll finally be able to exhale. But what happens when that apology never comes? What happens when years pass, and the silence grows louder, and the gap widens, and you're still standing there waiting? You start to lose yourself. And here's what most people don't realize. Adult children often don't apologize, not because they don't love you, but because they're trapped in their own narrative. In their minds, they've justified their behavior. They've built a story where they are the wounded party, where your actions, your words, your very presence became the problem they needed to distance themselves from. And in that story, an apology doesn't make sense. To apologize would mean admitting they were wrong. And for many people, especially in a culture that prizes independence and self-protection, that admission feels like weakness. So they stay silent, and you stay waiting. But there's a deeper layer here, a layer rooted in the way we, as a generation, were taught to parent. We gave everything. We sacrificed our own needs, our own dreams, our own sense of self, because that's what good parents did. We believed that if we loved hard enough, if we provided enough, if we showed up consistently enough, our children would grow up grateful, connected, and devoted. And many of them did. But some didn't, and the ones who didn't often carry their own pain, their own unprocessed wounds, their own unmet expectations of what a parent should have been. And instead of seeing our sacrifices, they see our flaws. Instead of remembering the thousands of moments we showed up, they remember the few moments we fell short. This is not about blame. It's about understanding. Because once you understand that their silence is not a reflection of your value, you can begin to release the grip that waiting has on your heart. Think about a man named Robert, 71 years old, devoted father of 3. One of his sons, his middle child, stopped speaking to him after Robert refused to lend him money for the 3rd time. Robert had his reasons. The money from the previous loans was never repaid, and Robert was living on a fixed income. But his son saw it differently. He saw rejection, abandonment, a father choosing money over family. And Robert waited. For 5 years, he waited for his son to understand, to see that Robert wasn't being cruel, just careful. He sent birthday cards, left voicemails, even wrote a long letter explaining his side. But the silence continued. And then one day, Robert's doctor told him his blood pressure was dangerously high. The stress was taking a physical toll. His wife gently suggested, maybe it's time to let it go. And Robert, exhausted and aching, finally asked himself a question he'd been avoiding. What am I actually waiting for? He realized he was waiting for his son to validate his decision, to say, Dad, I get it now, you were right. But his son was never going to say that, because in his son's story, Robert was still the villain. And Robert could spend the rest of his life waiting for that story to change, or he could write a new story for himself. So he did. He stopped reaching out, not out of bitterness, but out of self-preservation. He stopped checking his phone every hour, hoping for a message. He started going to a support group for parents estranged from their adult children. And slowly, the weight began to lift. Does this resonate with you? Let me know in the comments, because I know how isolating this kind of pain can feel. And I want you to know, you're not alone in this. There's another shift most people don't expect. When you stop waiting for an apology, you begin to see the relationship more clearly. Without the fog of hope and expectation clouding your vision, you start to notice patterns you ignored before. Maybe your child only reaches out when they need something. Maybe the relationship has always been one-sided, and you were too busy giving to notice. Maybe the version of them you're grieving never actually existed, and you've been mourning an ideal rather than a reality. This is a painful realization, but it's also a liberating one, because once you see the truth, you can stop blaming yourself for a dynamic that was never entirely in your control. Consider a woman named Diane. She's 68, and for years she bent over backward for her daughter, babysitting at a moment's notice, lending money she couldn't afford to give, cancelling her own plans to accommodate her daughter's needs. And when Diane finally said no just once, because she was genuinely exhausted and unwell, her daughter exploded. She accused Diane of being selfish, of never really caring, of always putting herself first. Diane was devastated. She replayed that conversation for months, trying to figure out where she went wrong. And then, during a conversation with an old friend, the friend asked her a simple question. Has your daughter ever apologized to you? For anything? Diane went silent. Because the answer was no. In 42 years, her daughter had never once said, I'm sorry, Mom. Not for the time she screamed at Diane in front of the grandchildren. Not for the cruel things she said during arguments. Not for the promises she broke or the guilt trip she laid at Diane's feet. And Diane realized she had been waiting for an apology from someone who didn't believe in giving them. That shift, that clarity, allowed Diane to stop taking it personally. It wasn't about her. It was about a pattern her daughter had carried into every relationship, and while that didn't erase the hurt, it did free Diane from the prison of self-blame. But that's only part of the picture, because letting go of the weight doesn't mean you stop loving your child. It doesn't mean you close the door forever. It means you stop making your emotional well-being dependent on their actions. It means you reclaim your power to feel whole, with or without their acknowledgement. And this is where it gets tricky, because we've been conditioned to believe that setting boundaries, that choosing ourselves, is somehow selfish. Especially as parents, we're supposed to be endlessly forgiving, endlessly available, endlessly understanding. But here's what nobody tells you: martyrdom is not a virtue. Sacrificing your peace, your health, your joy in the name of unconditional love is not noble. It's self-destruction. You can love your children deeply and still refuse to let them break you. Think about a man named Henry. He's 76, and his relationship with his son has been rocky for decades. His son struggles with addiction, and over the years, Henry has done everything. Paid for rehab, offered a place to stay, covered legal fees, and every time his son promised to change, and every time he didn't. And every time, when Henry finally set a boundary, his son lashed out, accused Henry of giving up on him, of being a bad father. And Henry, bless him, kept apologizing, kept trying to fix it, kept waiting for his son to wake up one day and say, "Dad, thank you. I see everything you've done for me." But that day never came, and Henry's health started to crumble under the stress. His wife begged him to step back, and finally, after a particularly brutal argument, Henry said, "I'm done. I love you, but I can't do this anymore." And his son didn't respond. Weeks went by, then months, and Henry grieved. He grieved hard, but he also noticed something surprising. He started sleeping better. His anxiety lessened. He started spending time with his wife again, really spending time, not just existing in the same room while his mind obsessed over his son. He started painting again, something he'd loved in his youth but had abandoned because he never had the energy. And one evening, sitting on his porch watching the sunset, Henry realized something profound. He had been waiting for his son to give him permission to live, and by stopping the wait, he gave that permission to himself. If this one surprised you, I'd love to hear your thoughts below, because this idea that we can choose peace even when the relationship is unresolved can feel almost radical. But it's true. Then comes a quieter change, a change that happens in your internal dialogue. When you're waiting for an apology, your mind is constantly prosecuting the case, rehashing old arguments, building evidence of how you were wronged, imagining what you'll say when they finally come around. And that constant mental loop is exhausting. It keeps you stuck in the past, reliving pain instead of processing it. But when you stop waiting, you stop rehearsing. You stop preparing for a conversation that may never happen. And in that space, something new emerges. Acceptance. Not the kind of acceptance that says what happened was okay, but the kind that says, this is what is, and I can move forward anyway. Let me tell you about a woman named Patricia. She's 70, and for 6 years she was estranged from her daughter after a bitter divorce where her daughter sided with her ex-husband. Patricia couldn't understand it. She'd been a devoted mother. She'd stayed in a difficult marriage for years to keep the family together, and when she finally left, her daughter turned on her. Patricia spent those 6 years mentally arguing with her daughter. Every time she was alone, she'd find herself explaining, defending, justifying. She'd imagine the moment her daughter would finally understand and apologize, and it consumed her. But then Patricia joined a meditation group at her community center, and one day the instructor said something that stuck with her. You don't have to forgive anyone, but you do have to release them from your mind. At first, Patricia didn't understand, but slowly she started practicing. Every time her mind drifted into the argument, she'd gently redirect it, not by suppressing the feelings, but by choosing not to feed the story. And over time, the mental loop quieted, the charge lessened, and Patricia found herself thinking about her daughter less and less. Not because she stopped caring, but because she stopped fighting a battle that couldn't be won in her head. And this leads us to a truth that is often harder to accept. Sometimes the apology doesn't come because your child genuinely believes they have nothing to apologize for. They've rewritten history in their minds, and in that version, you are the one who caused the harm, and no amount of waiting, explaining, or hoping will change that. This is where radical acceptance comes in. Not agreement, not approval, but acknowledgement of what is, without the suffering of wishing it were different. There's a concept in psychology called ambiguous loss. It's the grief we feel when someone is physically present but emotionally absent, or when a relationship exists in a state of limbo. It's the hardest kind of loss to process because there's no closure, no funeral, no final goodbye, just an open wound that never quite heals because you keep hoping it will resolve. Waiting for an apology is a form of ambiguous loss. You're grieving a relationship that isn't quite dead, but isn't fully alive either. And the waiting keeps you stuck in that in-between space, unable to fully mourn and unable to fully move on. But here's the powerful part. You can create your own closure. You don't need their permission or their participation. You can write a letter you never send, saying everything you need to say. You can hold a private ritual, symbolically releasing the relationship from the grip of expectation. You can sit with a trusted friend or therapist and give yourself permission to grieve not just the relationship, but the dream of what you hoped it would be. And in that grief, you'll find something unexpected. Freedom. Think about a man named George. He's 69, and his daughter hasn't spoken to him in over a decade. The rift started over a disagreement about religion. George is deeply spiritual, and his daughter rejected everything he believed in. And when George tried to talk to her about it, she accused him of being judgmental and controlling. George tried to explain that wasn't his intention, but she wouldn't hear it. And just like that, she was gone. For years, George prayed she'd come back. He left the door open, sent cards, held space for her at every family gathering. And she never came. And then one day, George's best friend died suddenly, and at the funeral, surrounded by grief, George had a realization. Life is short, brutally, unfairly short, and he had spent a decade of his life emotionally paralyzed, waiting for his daughter to change her mind. A decade he would never get back. George made a choice. He wrote his daughter one final letter. In it, he told her he loved her, that he was sorry for any pain he caused, even if it was unintentional, and that he was releasing her from any obligation to respond. He told her the door would always be open, but he would no longer wait beside it. Then he mailed it. She never replied, but George felt lighter. He had said what he needed to say, and he let go of the outcome. If these conversations are helping you see your life differently, I invite you to stay, not for me, but for yourself. Each week, we explore the truths that matter most in this season of life. Here is the final shift. When you stop waiting for an apology, you rediscover your voice. For years, you may have walked on eggshells, softened your words, minimized your needs to keep the peace. In that silence, you forgot how to speak your truth. When you stop waiting, you remember your wisdom, your boundaries, your right to take up space. Everything shifts. Not because they apologize, but because you no longer need them to. Elaine, 74, wrote her story after years of estrangement. Not a letter to her son, but a memoir for herself. She wrote joy, heartbreak, mistakes, and the grace she once withheld. In writing, she found her voice again. Her other children read it. They understood her more deeply. Connection grew. Releasing one relationship made room for others. Your story doesn't end with silence. Breathe. Release the grip. Stop waiting and give yourself love.